All right. Well, thank you for joining me again on the Unbroken Ground. This is season 2, episode 23, continuation from last week's season 2, episode 22, which was Does God Want Me to Suffer? And last week we talked a lot about, I talked a lot about Job. This week I'm going to talk about Jesus and some of the things that he said for the disciples and what that means, and also just kind of look into some of the continuing questions that surrounding, the kind of world that God can create, and whether or not he can logically have a world where people can freely choose to either love him or not love him. And if such a world can exist, is it then logical that he would be able to keep us from doing either the best or worst things, and then also keep us from suffering? And so is that a logical concept, or is that an illogical concept? And also just kind of the idea that even Jesus tells his followers that they're going to have trouble in this world. And what does that mean? What does it look like for us? So sit back, relax, and join in. Again, you can always email me at theunbrokenground@gmail.com. You can also find me on Facebook at The Unbroken Ground, or on Instagram, The Unbroken Ground. Be real. All places that you can send me ideas or ask questions. And thanks for listening, and let's jump in. All right, here we go with part 2. If you didn't listen to part 1, short summary is why do we have suffering? We're talking about the story of Job, and we got kind of the point of last week where we're asking the question is, if God is all powerful and God is all good, then why does suffering, on the level that it does, why does that kind of suffering exist? And I'm using the lens of what God has kind of revealed through the Old Testament at a very early date, to kind of challenge the common assumption that it's a like for like. As the amount of evil you have, that's the amount of evil that'll be rendered onto you. The amount of good that you do, the amount of good that you'll get. And God is like, that's not exactly how it happens. Although the prescription is for life is that we should try to do as much good as we can to all people in all situations, and avoid evil and bad things whenever we can. Okay, so that's where we're kind of at. And so Job gets to his friends and he's like, look, you guys are not helpful. The person I really need to talk to is God. If I could just sit down and talk with God, I could explain some things, and he could be able to kind of maybe give me an answer for why things are the way they are. And so he kind of says this a couple times, and of course God's like, all right, Job, let's have a talk. And so before we talk about that, I want to talk about this. There is a mystery that we have to embrace when we're talking about God, because we don't know everything about God. We will never know everything about God this side of heaven, and even into heaven. There's a sense that we will continue to just learn about God and learn new things about God, moment by moment, because He is vast and unknowable, and so, like, as finite minds trying to wrap ourselves around how God, who is infinite, interacts and works within a finite space and a finite time, how an infinite being is able to enter into those type of things. There's a whole lot of craziness that we could talk about. I'm not going to, but there's a mystery that exists, and that's why I like the story of Job is actually, I don't get too far ahead of myself, but it's actually very unsatisfactory when you ask the question, if you think Job is answering the question, why do bad things happen to good people? Or why does suffering exist? It's pretty unsatisfying, and we'll get into that in a little bit later in the podcast. But so what I want to talk then, as we got to the last part of the part 2 last week, part 1, now we're in part 2, was this: can God create a world if He is all powerful and He's all good, and so then suffering, then He's got some hand in suffering, because if He's all powerful, then He could step in and stop the suffering. He could step in and stop the things. But could God create a world that is orderly, that makes sense, that kind of runs without chaos all the time, but actually kind of has laws, both physical and spiritual, that work in? Could God create a world like that and also constantly intervene for every act of evil and excessive suffering? Could he create a world where he is constantly intervening for the evil acts of people and for the suffering that those cause, and all those things? Could he do that and still have a world that allows for what he desires most, which is a free, loving relationship between creator and creation? Could he create such a world? So that's kind of the question of, is that a logical thing that he could do? So if God is all powerful, we have to put some caveats on that, because there are some things that we that feel philosophically, these philosophy majors have pointed out, like, can God create a round square? Well, that's a logical fallacy. You can't create a round square because a square has 90-degree angles, and a circle does not have 90-degree angles. And so if it's round, then it's not square. Those are two different shapes. Now you could create a rounded square, maybe, although that's really probably by definition not even a square anymore, because square has 90-degree angles. But you cannot create a round square or a square circle. Like those, it goes both ways, right? Like a circle has, you can't just be like, well, a circle is round and it has radiuses and all this, but now it's square shaped. No, square, those are separate things. And so it's a logical fallacy. Like, could God create a rock so big that he couldn't move it? Right? Like it's a logical fallacy. I mean, why would God want to create a rock big enough that he couldn't move it? I don't know. But that's like, so when we get into like, is God all powerful? Is he omnipotent? This is the type of things that philosophy majors will ask and think about. Like, what's the logical, and this is where we get into kind of the mystery part that we'll get a little deeper into this week, because I didn't want to get into it last week. And so, but what's the logical understanding of what it means to be all powerful and all good? Because again, if you're all powerful and you're all good, it seems that you could, at the very least, reduce and maybe even just get rid of all suffering. Because if you can do whatever you want, because you're all powerful and you're a free being, and God is those things, and you're good, and so you'd want to see people, not suffer. It would seem that's like, even people who don't know God or don't really love God would still know that they don't. Like, it is a good thing to not wish suffering on people or not allow people to suffer. So if you're all powerful and all good, then would you not just get rid of suffering? So my deep theological thought on that is that you cannot actually create a world where you have free beings, which however free you want us to be. I'm just saying that if we're going to freely love, which is what God seems to desire, is for us to freely respond to his love and to freely give our love, then we have to have some amount of freedom, regardless of God's sovereignty. And how all that works, I don't know. But if you're going to create a world where you have the free choice of saying yes or no to God, to say yes to a loving relationship with God, or to say no to that, in order to have that kind of world, then you have to have the freedom to do, because you have the freedom to do those good things and those wonderful things and those great things, then you also have to have the freedom to not do them, or it's not meaningful. Like, if you always make the good choice because that's the only choice you have, then that's not very meaningful. If you love God because you don't have a choice in it, then is that even really love? Like, there is a in true love, in real love, and the definition of love, there is a aspect that has to be free. It has to be freely given, freely received, and it can't be forced. Like, you can't just walk up to somebody and be like, "Hey, love me," or I'm going to shoot you with this gun. That's really violent, but it gets the point across. Like, they would love you because they were afraid of being shot by the gun, but they would not choose to love you for any other reason. So the question again, then on the topic is: could God create such a world where He could have beings that can freely choose to love or not love Him, and also not have suffering? So if you have a world where you can do the greatest good, and logically, then you also have to have the ability to do the greatest evil. And because God sparingly enters into the world, then it does mean that logically He has to, because He allows us to freely do the best things, then He also will allow us to freely do the worst things. And some of that is just in the, if you want to, in the logical sense, if you want to have free acting beings to be able to freely love, to truly love, to have that love relationship, then you open the door. You open the door to allowing people to be the worst possible version of humanity. And there may be, it's hard to say because you can't prove a negative. Maybe there are worse things that God stopped and we just don't know. Maybe there's worse suffering out there and we just because the other side of this is that whatever suffering we have, whatever the worst thing is, that is going to be on the level of, even if God was like, okay, well, we're not going to have things like the Holocaust or the nuclear bomb, then there will be something else that we would consider the worst suffering, and we would ask the same question: God, why does this even exist? Because we don't know things without knowing their opposite. That's just how we as humans work. We don't know light and dark until we actually see it. We don't understand darkness until we're in it. We don't understand light and why it's so good until we see it. And so you whatever, if it's the way, just think about it, what is considered poor? It depends on what time, what period of the United States you're talking about, the world you're talking about, and it depends on your definition. And it's it's just a quantitative. We just kind of put if everybody had, $20 million, we're all 20 millionaires, but then there were some people that were billionaires. We would still be oh, the 20 millionaires are, or if the majority of people were billionaires or whatever, we'd be oh, the 20 million people, those are the poor guys. They just don't have as much. That's literally the way that our world works. We just have, whatever the worst, that's going to be whatever it is that we're they're poor, they're bad. Not that poor people are bad, but that's sometimes how we view that. Unfortunately, we've made it a moral decision that people would be rich or poor, and we've tied it into whether God is blessing people by giving you resources, which actually goes really well with this because, again, the flip side is not the same. Does God want you to suffer because of the bad things that you've done? No. Is God only blessing you because of the good things that you've done? No. That's not how this works, because, and this is where this is what I pointed to earlier, because there's actually a mystery that surrounds God. How do we know this? Okay, good question. We know this because in the book of Job, as an audience, we get to know why Job suffers. Job suffers because he is the subject of a cosmic test. This testing to see if we give up on Job, then he will give up on us. And so as an audience, we get to see that insight. But here's the thing. God comes down to talk to Job because Job says, if God would just be here face to face, I could explain this. I think I could figure this out. We could work this out. God comes down to talk to Job. You know what? God never tells Job? God never tells Job why he has to suffer. Let that sink in. Just because you and I know. Just because we get a window into that. God comes down to answer Job's questions. And he never says, hey, Job, by the way, you're right. You were righteous. You were good. The reason that you had these things happen to you was because there was a cosmic test going on, and I just wanted to prove that you would love me and praise me, whether you had a whole lot or you had a whole little. You did great, buddy. Good job. God never says that. What God says is, hi, Job. Do you know how to direct the lightning bolts? Do you know how to store snow? Do you know how to get the Leviathan to go the right direction? Do you know how to map out the world? Were you there when this was happening? Are you big enough to do that? Are you smart enough? Are you wise enough to do all that? Answer, Job. Tell me, do you know all of these cosmic things? And Job, being a very smart man and a righteous man, was like, I'm not going to say anything because you are far beyond above me. There's a mystery that exists. And God actually points to this, I think, in the book of Job, which is to say, in the sense of like what we might, if we were God, we might come down and be like, Job, you did a great job, buddy. Me and the accuser were just sitting there. We were talking, and I said, hey, look at Job. Look how good a person he is. And the accuser was like, yeah, because you've blessed him with all the things. And, of course, he's going to be, good when you bless him with all the things. And so I was like, all right, take the things away. And Job, you knocked it out of the park. You kept on praising me, even in the midst of tragedy. He's like, good job. Never happens. Never said. Instead, God says, do you know how big I am? Do you know how great I am? Do you know that I am far and beyond above you in every way? And that's not even like a humble brag or like a pull and rank, because God is that. He is bigger and more massive, and that's who he is. And Job's like, yeah, I don't want to speak. I said that I wanted to state my case in front of God, but I no longer do. So even from an early time, there actually is a lot of ambiguity and mystery built into this whole thing of like what it means to follow God. You get to the New Testament. People are still asking this question. There's a man born blind. They're like, Jesus, this guy is born blind. Whose fault was it? Was it his fault? Did he do something like while he was in the womb, some sin? Was it his parents' fault? Like, did his parents do some sin that caused him to be born blind? And Jesus is like, no. Jesus doesn't even answer that question, which again is just like, hey, here's some more mystery. Jesus is not like, yeah, oh, here, let me explain to you why they're suffering, or let me explain to you why this guy has gone blind. Let me explain to you all the cosmic reasons behind it. He's like, no, it's not for any of that. He's like, this guy is born blind so that he can be an instrument of God's glory. And then he heals him. Like Jesus is like, that's not it about this at all. Like he talks about, even in another place in the Gospels, he's like, there's this tower that falls on people and these people die. And he's like, do you think they were more sinful than anybody else? Do you think they deserved it? Do you think they did something? Do you think that somehow they, in God's eyes, were more sinful? And he's like, no, that's not how this world works. And so there's this mystery that kind of lives and circulates around like both blessing and success. Again, it's very clear that we ought to live our lives doing good, the best good that we can, the most good that we can to everybody that we meet. However, there is no guarantee that that will give us the blessings or the blessings that we hope for, or all the blessings that we wanted in this life. And Jesus himself says that. He's like, you're going to have, he told his disciples, his closest followers, the ones who, got it straight from the source. He's like, you guys are going to have trouble in this world, but I've overcome it. I've overcome it. You have joy because I have overcome the world. But don't get it twisted, right? Don't get it messed up. You're going to have trouble in the world. And like Peter's like, and James and John and the disciples like, Jesus, we left everything for you, right? Like, he's like, what are we going to get? And they're like, Jesus, I want to sit at your left and your right hand. And he's like, can you drink the cup? And the cup was like the suffering that, and it's like, no. Like, Paul, who was one of the closest friends of God, I think, you got like Paul and you got like David, and these guys are super close friends of God. And yeah, Paul suffered. And in fact, we've got this weird passage in scripture where Paul's like, I've got a thorn in my flesh and I've been praying that it will be taken away. And God's like, my strength is enough. My grace is enough. My care is enough for you. I'm not going to take that away. You're going to suffer. And you're like, well, you mean Paul, the guy who suffered so much so that he could bring the gospel? Like, so he could tell people, like some people would be like, oh, well, see, Paul had to pay because he was a Pharisee who, was punishing followers of Jesus. And so in order to pay for that, then he's got this thorn. And it's like, no, not in at all. That's karma. But karma's not how the world works. Like we try to make order out of it because we want stories to make sense. We want our lives to make sense. Like, that's the stories that we tell. Those are the stories that we like, where the good guy gets their comeuppance the bad guy gets their comeuppance, and the good guy gets the girl and the rewards and all that kind of stuff. And we love those kind of stories, and we watch those movies, and we make them over and over and over again to try to make sense of our world or how we think the world should be. And so we would be like, oh, and I mean, it just continues on in that there's a mystery that exists. Because it's not one-to-one. It's not, if you do this, then you'll get this. If you pray this prayer, then you'll get this. There's no way to manipulate God into giving you the things that you want. There's no way to manipulate God to be like, hey, God, I don't want to suffer. So what do I need to do? What do I need to do to take care of that? I don't want to suffer. What is it that you need me to do? And it's just not there. It's just not there. Again, there's a description and a prescription of how we ought to live life. But there's no guarantee that if you live the best life, that you won't have something terrible happen to you. Jesus didn't even promise that to his followers. In fact, Jesus promised that you would have trouble. You'd have much trouble in this world. And the comfort that he gave to his followers was just like, but I've overcome the world. One day, it'll all be set right. But the expectation shouldn't be that, well, if I get baptized, if I follow Jesus, if I'm walking with God, then suffering won't happen to me. That's actually not at all what Scripture promises. In fact, it's the opposite. If you're a follower of Christ, you're going to have trouble. You're going to have tribulations. You're going to have trials. And in fact, there is at least some sense, if you look at James, where it says that the trials and the struggles that we go through actually help us become better. They refine us. They help us become better followers of Jesus. They help us become better people. And it makes sense because we understand this from a human perspective, which is to say that, like, if you want to get stronger in your physical muscles, then you have to lift weights that challenge you. If you don't lift weights that challenge you, then you won't get stronger. Like, your muscles just won't grow. You won't grow bigger. So you have to struggle. You have to cause yourself pain in order to get bigger muscles. And so there's a spiritual sense to that. Like, if you want to grow faith, if you want to grow a spiritual walk with God, then you have to go through struggle. And if you don't, then you actually will have a very weak faith, a very childish faith. You won't have a mature faith. Like, when you sign up to say that you want to follow God, you're kind of signing up to just be in it. You're signing up just to be in it. And the call then is for us to just to rest in God's grace and to hear what he says to Paul, which is, my grace is sufficient for you. And we have to be okay with that, because we're not this side of heaven. We don't actually we can try to make sense of our suffering. We can try to make sense of the sickness that we go through. We can try to make sense of tragedy. We can try to make sense of evil and in the world, and why that seems to flourish, and what we should do about that, and why justice is so elusive, and why grace and forgiveness are continually the things that break into our lives and our hearts, because they are what humanity truly needs. All of those things are because there's a mystery that exists, because there's a mystery for us that says that we think we know how we should expect life to work. We think we know how the repercussions of our actions and what they'll be. But the truth is we don't. We're called to do good, as much good as we can, because that's what following God looks like, is to walk with the Spirit and do as much good as you can to as many people as you can. We're called to avoid evil. That's something that we're told to do, but it's not a prescription of avoiding suffering. Paul is just such a great example, because here he is. He's on his way. He's going in one place, and he gets a vision. Right, the man from Laodicea goes like, "Hey, come over here." You know, he gets a spiritual vision, a dream of like, "Hey, you were heading in one direction. I don't need you to go in the other direction." And most of us would love that, right? Like if we could just get, "Hey God, if you could just kind of send me some dreams, and so I know that I'm on the right path, or I know that I'm going the right direction, or I should change the directions I'm going." We think that we would love that, but here's the thing: like God has Paul go to this city, right? And here, what happens? Within 3 days, he's in prison. He's been beaten. He's bloodied. He is unjustly imprisoned. And so if you were keeping score at home, you might be like, okay, God, this is the kind of conversation I have with God. If I was Paul, I'd be like, God, remember how you were like, "Hey, let's go over here," and you sent that whole vision thing and that dream, and then we got here and I started doing the things that you want me to do, and now I'm in prison. Like, what's up with that? Like that. This doesn't seem to quite work out and the math of what I think the math should work out to be, right? Like, how come this happens? Why are bad things happening to me? God, I'm following you. I'm doing what you want. I'm proclaiming your good news where I'm supposed to. I'm doing what you want me to do. And yet here I am. I'm beaten. I'm in prison. And that's not what Paul does. Paul and Silas are in the prison cell, and they are praising God's name. praising God's name. And for those of you who are biblical scholars or have read these stories will know that what happens next is that as they're praising, there's this earthquake that happens. It throws open all the prison cell doors. Nobody leaves. The jailer's about to kill himself, and Paul says, "Hey, stop, buddy. Nobody's gone. Don't kill yourself. We're all here." And so the jailer comes and he gets Paul's wounds, and he heals them and takes them to his house. And from that, the whole jailer and his whole household get baptized. Like, God put Paul in the prison so that he could save this guy's household. Paul had to suffer. Paul had to ask, probably in his heart of hearts, like, God, did I hear you right? Am I in the right place? Because it doesn't feel like it, God. It doesn't really seem like I am where I'm supposed to be, because I'm suffering really, really harsh. You brought me here. What's up? And whether God and Paul had that discussion, I don't know. I do know that they were singing praises, though, at midnight in their chains, in their beaten and bloodied clothes, and they're aching, and they're not knowing what's going to happen tomorrow. Am I going to die and go see Jesus, which Paul considered gain anyway? That they're singing praise. And as they sing, God was able to turn their suffering into a miracle. He doesn't always. And I think that's the mystery that I think is so hard for us. Because we want to find redemption and meaning in all of our suffering. We need to. We need our suffering to make sense. So we search hard for meaning. Why God? Why, God, would you let me do this? Why, God, did you let this happen? God, what's the meaning behind this? Will I ever know? Why do some babies die and others don't? Why do some addicts why are they able to get clean and stay, and how come some aren't? How come those that call on your name still struggle with things like anxiety and depression and worry that just consumes them, steals their joy? We want to assign some kind of moral reality. And I said this about money earlier. Maybe that was last week. I can't remember this time, but this is one of the reasons that the disciples had such a hard time understanding some of Jesus' teaching, because the rich young man comes to him and Jesus says, what's the greatest commandment? And the rich young man's like, oh, I know this. I got this. Love the Lord your God. Love your man. Love fellow man, right? Love God, love others. There you go. 2 greatest commandments, what you're supposed to do. Jesus is like, you're very close to the kingdom of God. Now, here's what I need you to do. I need you to sell all of your money, give all your possessions away, sell all your possessions, give your money away, come follow me. And the rich young fool, the rich young man, the rich young Lord, went away very sad because he had a whole lot of money. And the disciples, who, remember, still lived under the system, and we kind of still do, that if you have blessings, you're prosperous, that means that God has granted you favor, and he looks down upon you with favor. And if you're poor, or if you're almost destitute, then that's because you've done something wrong. Like you're immoral and you're evil, and God is not going to bless you. But Jesus is like, yeah, no, rich people are not closer to heaven. Rich people are not closer to God. That's not it. That's not how this works. And in fact, he takes them to the temple, right? And the widow has scraped together, and she's able to give a penny, right? And he's like, the widow is more justified than the person who gave out of his abundance. And he's like, he's actually closer to the poor, right? He's actually more present, because they don't have the barrier of money and wealth to get in the way, and so all they could do is just be dependent upon him. And guess what God loves to be is God loves to be in the midst of people who are fully dependent upon him or wholly dependent upon him. And so he's like, yeah, the rich actually have a hard time because they have a hard time not doing it for themselves because they've got the resources. And yet those who are poor, he's like, yeah, they have a lot easier time. Is just saying, yeah, I can't do this, God. You're the only one who can do this. And so, yeah, it's actually almost backwards of this expectation. And so, just like with the people who brought the friends with Job, the expectation was you did something wrong, but now you're suffering for it. And Job's like, I didn't do anything wrong. And that's actually the truth. We know that. We get to know that, but Job never does. So, if you're asking the question, does God want me to suffer? The answer is, God wants you to develop your character and your faith. And the only way for that to happen is to have the freedom to experience both the best things of life and the worst things in life. And God may choose to shield you from some of the worst things in life, or he might allow them to happen to you. And we don't necessarily have a great vision or understanding of why. And honestly, the answer that he gives for Job is kind of hard to take at times. But the answer is, you're not God, so you won't understand. You can't see what I see. You can't know what I know. And so you have to come to grips with that. You have to come to terms with that you're a finite being who's not going to be able to understand all the reasons behind suffering. But we can't also just assign suffering as to this is bad people, and so bad things happen to bad people, and so I did enough good things, and so I shouldn't have bad things happen to me, because even the best of us will still have suffering. And sometimes that's because the suffering is the ways that we grow. That's the only way we can grow in our faith. That's the only way we can grow in our salvation. And to work that out is we work it out through when we're going through suffering. So, as James says, if you suffer, it leads to perseverance. Count it all joy, he says, right? When you suffer, because from suffering comes perseverance. It's a growth. It's something that accelerates our growth. Just like with lifting weights. You can't get stronger muscles unless you're lifting harder weights. And you can't get stronger spiritual muscles unless you go through some valleys, unless you go through some suffering. And so God allows us to suffer because it's the only way that we can grow in our strength of our faith. It's the only way we can mature. It doesn't mean that he visits upon you as a punishment. Sometimes he just allows it to work. So there's the answer. Probably not as certain as you want it to be. Certainly not as dry and cut as you want it to be. But there's the answer. Is that why does suffering happen? Suffering happens because God has to create a world that allows us to do the best that we can do and grow and be able to grow. And in order to that, he also then has to allow people to do the worst. And there may be some things of suffering that God has stopped that we'll just never know because we can't prove a negative. We don't know. We just don't see it. But it does mean that there are some terrible, terrible things that happen. And there is not necessarily any sense that we can make of it this side of heaven. And we know that God will redeem all things. How he'll do that, I can't hardly begin to believe or understand on this side, but I do believe that it will happen because God said it will. Thank you guys for joining me in this journey, walking through, does God want me to suffer? And I hope that you find some answers or at least some thoughts that'll help you. Be blessed, and we'll be back to our regular scheduled podcast next Sunday. Hope you have a wonderful week. See you next week.